On the first day of my 25th year, my mom set me up on a blind date. This was the 37th blind date in my life. Since I was 22 years old, there have been 2 blind dates every month, rain or shine, never missing one that I have successfully mastered the art of quickly scaring off my dates. I exaggeratedly walked in a catwalk style, dressed in a strange way, and behaved rather peculiarly. But the next moment, when I saw the person in front of me, I felt a moment of regret that he had almost perfect facial features. His profile was well defined, with a straight and prominent nose. The black suit outlined his perfect figure. His fingers were long, slender, and fair, with well-defined knuckles. I reached out my hand to shake his, and the touch was so delicate that I couldn't help but swallow. "I'm in a hurry. Let me tell you my requirements. It's simple. You don't need to interfere in my affairs, and I'll take care of all of yours." I nodded woodenly, staring at him blankly. Was I dreaming? This is a gift about 30 million. And there's also a waterfront villa. You'll get an allowance of 500,000 every month after we get married. Do you have any other requirements? I just knew I had been reading too many novels lately. I was actually daydreaming. I suddenly pinched my thigh hard. It hurt so much that tears welled up in my eyes. And I muttered a curse under my breath. Was this real? Was it a windfall? If Miss Smith feels wronged. No, not at all. How could that be? It's rather Mr. Johnson who might feel wronged. Thank you so much for coming all the way for this blind date. Johnson's mouth twitched slightly. I didn't notice my terrible makeup at all that day and just kept smiling at him. To prevent him from changing his mind, I immediately went to the courthouse with him to get married. Only when I got that marriage certificate did the knot in my heart finally loosen. I carefully put it away and bowed deeply to my husband. "Mr. Johnson, see you in the next life." "Ah, no. See you if fate allows." "Oh no. I mean you can call me anytime if you need anything, and I won't bother you at other times." Johnson's face darkened, and I didn't know what he was thinking. Every cell in my body was screaming to go and have a great feast and shopping spree. "Okay." Johnson coldly uttered this word and then turned around and drove away in his Maybach, and I quickly took out my phone and called my best friend, Emily, during dinner. I carefully took the marriage certificate out of my bag and placed it on the dining table. That I watched as my parents' expressions changed from shock to bewilderment, then to panic, and finally to being tongue-tied. In just a few seconds, dozens of expressions flashed across their faces. It was so wonderful. It was like a textbook performance. "Sarah, do you want to drive your parents crazy? I'm going to teach you a lesson today." My mom roared at me, and turned around looking for a weapon to hit me with. When I saw this, I immediately hid behind my dad and pleaded pitifully. "Come here right now." "I won't. This is the blind date you set me up on. Why are you so angry now?" My mom was taken aback for a moment and quickly opened the marriage certificate. My parents looked at the photo on it and showed satisfied smiles. I heaved a sigh of relief. But the next second, my mom's duster landed on my butt. I let out a yelp and looked at her with teary eyes. "Even so, you can't be so hasty. Although he has a good family background and looks handsome, we still don't know his character. How could you get married in such a hurry? We knew each other in high school. We liked each other back then. But he went to study abroad later. The long distance and time difference made us lose touch with each other." I felt a little uneasy in my heart. I guess watching too much TV really helps with making up excuses. "I'm so good at it." My mom looked at me with suspicion in her eyes. I added more details and made up more stories, and finally managed to dispel their doubts. Then I took out that bank book. "This is the wedding gift. You keep this money for yourself. Your dad and I don't need such formalities. As long as you're happy, we'll be at ease. We still have enough money for our retirement." I nodded and put the card away. Of course, I didn't dare to tell them how much money was in it, because I had been lying the whole time. So I made up an excuse, telling them that Johnson's parents were abroad and couldn't come back. So we planned to keep the wedding simple and have a honeymoon trip instead. Fortunately, they were open-minded and didn't ask too many questions. That night, I secretly sent Johnson a message on WhatsApp, asking him to come to our house tomorrow if he had time. At least to make my parents feel at ease. I thought he wouldn't bother to reply to me. But half an hour later, I received a reply, just one word. Okay.so I took advantage of the situation and sent another message. Drive a cheaper car. This message was like a stone dropped into the sea and never got a reply. The next day, when I went downstairs to buy breakfast and came back, I saw a group of gossipy neighbors gathered at the door. I was about to walk faster when someone called me from behind. Sarah. I couldn't help but shudder. I turned around and saw Johnson in a suit. He looked so noble that he didn't fit in with the surroundings at all. That I smiled awkwardly and nodded at him. That he carried a lot of gift boxes and walked towards me. I glanced at the car behind him, frowned, and asked in a low voice, "Didn't I say to drive a cheaper car? This is the cheapest one I have." People's joys and sorrows are not the same. As soon as we entered the house, my parents pulled Johnson over and started praising him. My mom kept winking at me and giving me a thumbs up. Johnson, I heard from Sarah that you two liked each other in high school. It's been almost 10 years, and you two still have feelings for each other. It's really a match made in heaven. Johnson looked at me. I felt guilty and turned my face away, not daring to look at them. But this guy was even better at lying than me. With just a few words, he had my parents eating out of his hand. That I still hadn't come to my senses even when I got in his car and we drove all the way to the villa. After Johnson dropped me off at the villa, he said he had something urgent to deal with at the company and left. That I immediately understood and made an okay gesture. That I knew all about this kind of thing. After I took a shower and lay on the bed, I finally understood the troubles of the rich. The empty room even had an echo when I spoke. That I looked at the balance in the bank card. So this was the price of being rich. Let me suffer from this kind of misery for the rest of my life. For several days in a row, Johnson didn't come to the villa. I was quite happy and didn't even think about it at all, until that day. Emily and I came out of an upscale restaurant and happened to run into my CEO husband. At that moment, he was holding a beautiful woman on his arm. And the two of them were being very affectionate as they walked towards the restaurant. That I was about to bump into them. Hidden. In a flash of inspiration, I immediately pretended to be blind, put on my sunglasses and a mask, and quickened my pace as I passed by them. That I kept chanting in my heart, "Please don't recognize me. Please don't recognize me." Sarah, what are you doing acting crazy in the evening? I swear, if killing wasn't illegal, I'd already be on my way to being banished to some far-off place. That I quickly pulled Emily around the corner and out of the door. We ran a long way before I finally let out a sigh of relief. Just then, my phone dinged with a new message on WhatsApp. I opened it and saw that it was from Johnson. "Where are you?" Emily peeked over. I just stood there, stunned, my mind racing as I tried to figure out what to reply. "Your boss is so overbearing. Does he have to meddle in everything even at night?" And with that, Emily snatched my phone and replied, "Mind your own business. If you're so brave, come find me at my place." Then she even had the nerve to block and delete him. In just a few seconds, my life seemed to be doomed. And that silly Emily was looking at me with a big smile. "Anyway, you were going to quit your job. Don't ever let yourself be pushed around. Don't spoil a person like that." Great. Just great. She's really my wonderful best friend. My whole life's happiness is now ruined by your harebrained actions. What's wrong? Sarah, why are you crying? Nothing. I'm just emotional. When I got back to the villa, I quickly tried to add Johnson on WhatsApp. I had already thought up a long explanation, but he never approved my friend request. Just when I was at my wit's end, I heard the sound of a car outside downstairs, followed by footsteps and the sound of the door opening. A few minutes later, I was looking at Johnson standing right in front of me. I couldn't help but swallow nervously. Why are you back?" Johnson took off his watch and tie, and with one hand, he started unbuttoning his shirt. He exuded a dangerous charm. There was a faint smile on his face, but it was like the smile of the Grim Reaper, ready to claim my life at any moment. "Of course I'm here to settle the score." I hugged the blanket tightly and timidly shrank my head. Let me explain. Go on." He took a step forward and grabbed my foot that was sticking out from under the blanket, pulling me right under him. "So silly. You hide your head but not your tail. You're the silly one," I thought to myself. Of course, I didn't dare say it out loud. I clenched the blanket with both hands and held it against my chest. Looking nervous, His handsome face suddenly loomed large in front of me. My heart skipped a beat. And then it started pounding like crazy. His face slowly moved closer. My palms were already sweating. I closed my eyes just as he was about to get close. But then I heard him chuckle softly in my ear. My face turned bright red. How embarrassing. He picked up my phone, looked at the name I had saved him as, and his face darkened. He handed the phone back to me, gesturing for me to explain what that meant. That I looked at the word boss on it and was lost in thought. You seem to have a lot of free time. I nodded obediently, afraid of angering this money-making god. So the person I saw at the door today was you. I nodded like a bobblehead, always keeping a smile on my face. After all, a smile can turn away wrath. Then why did you run away? Don't say you didn't see me. Tell me the truth. I was just about to open my mouth and give the explanation I had prepared in advance. But his question left me speechless. I was just worried that the girl beside you might get the wrong idea. I rubbed my nose and gave a sheepish smile, carefully observing his expression. But I had no idea what had made him unhappy. He got up with a cold face and walked towards the door. When he reached the door, he suddenly stopped and turned around to look at me. Since you have so much free time and gave me such a thoughtful name in your contacts, then come to the company tomorrow to start working. I frowned when I heard this, just as I was about to refuse. Johnson slammed the door shut, which made my heart jump in fright. So the next day, I went to the company with a downcast look to start working as Johnson's personal assistant, but this personal assistant job was really too easy. I didn't have to do anything. I just needed to show up on time for work and leave on time, and get scolded by Johnson a few times. On a spring afternoon, people always feel lazy. I was lying on the table, watching a TV show, and accidentally fell asleep. When I woke up, there were only Johnson and me left in the entire office. Mr. Johnson, you're still working? Then I'll go first. Keep up the good work. After saying that, I picked up my bag and turned to run away, but Johnson grabbed me from behind. I turned around and looked at him. Only then did I notice that his computer was already turned off and his desk was neatly tidied up. Was he waiting for me? Let's go have dinner together. Before I could react, I was already being pulled by him and got into the car. He drove me to a private restaurant, looking at the delicious food on the table. My stomach growled embarrassingly. I don't know if it suits your taste. Give it a try. My eyes lit up, and I nodded eagerly and started tasting. It was simply delicious. The person is. No, that's not what I meant. When we came out after dinner, I stood on the side of the road and hailed a taxi, but then I saw Johnson driving over. I can go back by myself. Mr. Johnson, you go ahead and do your thing. Don't worry about me. Thank you for tonight's treat. I'll go first. I hopped into the taxi, feeling extremely pleased with myself. This was what a smart woman should do. She should always be aware of her position and not cause the boss any trouble, for some reason. After that dinner together, I hadn't seen Johnson for several days. He didn't even come to the company. I overheard a few colleagues talking privately. They said that Johnson was on vacation abroad with a little model. A model. Another one. I also heard that Mr. Johnson is actually married. All these women are his mistresses on the side. I wonder if his wife knows. What the hell? This won't do. How dare they ruin my boss's reputation? No, you guys have it all wrong. My voice came from behind the wall. The few of them were so startled that they almost screamed. Then I slowly came out from behind. When they saw it was me, they heaved a sigh of relief. You're new here, so you don't know our Mr. Johnson. Just then, my phone rang. I looked down and saw that it was Johnson calling, so I quickly ran to the office to answer it. Come pick me up after work. I'll send you the address on WhatsApp. After hanging up the phone, I looked at the address. It was a high-end restaurant. I checked the navigation and it was quite close to the company. After work, I had a simple meal nearby and then went to wait outside the restaurant for Johnson at the appointed time. I'm downstairs. Okay, I'll be right down. I turned off my phone and quietly waited for Johnson to come out. The people coming in and out of the restaurant all stared at me and whispered among themselves. I looked at them in confusion. What were they looking at? What was so interesting? But the next moment, Johnson came out of the restaurant with several executives. When they saw me waiting at the door on my moped, they all fell into a long silence. Those executives smiled and patted Johnson on the shoulder, then got into their luxury cars and drove away. It left just the two of us in the cold wind, looking at each other. This really wasn't my fault. I didn't know he was out on business. Now I was in big trouble. Who could come and save me? Mr. Johnson, should I call you a taxi? No need. He walked towards me with long strides, with a swing of his long legs. He sat down on the back seat of the moped. I stood there, stunned. It was only when his hand landed on my waist that I came to my senses. Where should I take you, Mr. Johnson? Home. Which home? The pressure on my waist suddenly increased, and it hurt so much that tears came to my eyes. This guy really held a grudge. Of course, the home we share. He almost gritted his teeth as he said this. I secretly rejoiced that he didn't continue to argue with me and started riding the moped back. The moped was too small. Johnson's long legs were curled up in a very strange position. His shoes rubbed against the ground all the way. By the time we reached the villa, the toes of his shoes were worn out. I gave an awkward smile. Johnson's face was darker than the bottom of his worn-out shoes. He sat there, looking wronged and not moving. Mr. Johnson, we're home. When he heard my words, he still refused to move. I was extremely scared. Was he going to divorce me? Mr. Johnson, I'll buy you a new pair of shoes tomorrow. Please don't be angry. He suddenly looked up at me. Under the moonlight, his features were as beautiful as a painting, but he looked unhappy, making people afraid to approach. Damn it, my legs are numb. Help me up quickly. Ha ha ha. I squatted on the ground and laughed my head off. This was the first time I had seen Johnson in such an awkward situation. Usually, he always had a cold and distant look. This was really a rare sight. When I had laughed enough, I slowly got up to help him. Johnson's face was red. His originally fair skin now had 2 red patches. His eyes were as red as a rabbit's. He looked extremely wronged. Damn. Why was he kind of cute? Johnson was 6 feet 3 inches tall, and his whole body was pressing on me, as if he was taking revenge. He was incredibly heavy. Can't you use a little more strength? Are you even capable of this? The worst thing is when the air suddenly goes quiet. The worst thing is this sudden concern. The responsibility on my shoulders seemed to get a little heavier. I even suspected that Johnson did it on purpose. If it wasn't for the sound of his feet still rubbing against the ground, finally, I managed to carry him upstairs. I lay on the sofa, gasping for breath. I was really exhausted. The next moment, Mr. Johnson was bouncing around in front of me full of energy, as if he could easily climb up 20 floors in one go. I stared at him in disbelief. What a sneaky guy. I had been fooled again. Just as I was about to argue a couple of sentences to show my anger, Johnson suddenly leaned in close to me and planted a kiss on my cheek. Our eyes met, and my face turned as red as a piece of liver. Sarah, you just asked me if I was capable. My hands nervously clutched the sofa cushion. In an instant, 800 thoughts flashed through my mind. Oh no, how could I come up with an explanation that didn't seem so perfunctory? He leaned forward, pinning me between the sofa. I couldn't help but admire the masterpiece of Mother Nature. Who wouldn't like a face like his? Sarah, I like you. Half a year after getting married, just now my husband confessed his love to me. The person involved was extremely nervous and had already started imagining what our children would look like in the future. When his kiss landed, I felt my eyes go dark and my head go dizzy. A rush of heat spread from my brain. I had a nosebleed. Oh, I hid myself under the covers, feeling ashamed of my uselessness just now. How could I have a nosebleed just from a kiss? Sarah, have you been single for too long? Can't you handle such an exciting scene? What will you do in the future? This is just the beginning. Can't you even stand this? Early the next morning, I appeared in front of Johnson with 2 panda eyes. He was just coming out of the kitchen with breakfast. When he saw me, he was taken aback, and then he gently called me over to eat. Didn't you sleep well alone last night? I poked at the porridge in my bowl, my thoughts already wandering far away. Who was that woman I saw outside the restaurant that day? And who was that model that my colleagues were gossiping about? How many other women did Johnson have outside? Was his affection for me just a passing fancy or was it genuine? My mind was more muddled than the porridge in my bowl. I had no appetite at all. So I simply turned around and went upstairs. Not long after, Johnson followed me upstairs first. He bent down and touched my forehead to make sure I wasn't running a fever. Then he brought some other snacks for me to eat. I'm not hungry. His eyebrows shot up, as if he was really surprised. I, who could usually eat like a horse, actually had no appetite today. Are you still upset about what happened last night? Of course not. I'm angry because you've been flirting around outside. Looking at his handsome face, I got even angrier. I sat up straight, reached out and pinched his face, kneading it hard. Humph. I'll squish you flat. Let's see how you can still go around flirting with other women. Sarah, what's wrong with you? Johnson looked at me with a mixture of amusement and helplessness, his eyes full of affection, making it impossible to resist. His words seemed to have some kind of magic, and his eyes were also bewitching. Before I knew it, I blurted out, "Where have you been these past few days?" "Negotiating a contract." "What about that little model?" "What little model?" "Humph. Still pretending. Fine. Then who was that woman I saw holding your arm outside the restaurant that day?" Johnson suddenly smiled, curling his lips. I was confused by his smile and immediately straightened my face, asking sternly, "Be serious. Stop fooling around. Just because you're a bit good-looking doesn't mean you can charm people like this." He reached out and wrapped his arm around my waist, leaning down to kiss my lips. This kiss was gentle and lingering. My cheeks were burning hot, and I tightly hugged his slender waist that he pressed closer and then picked me up and we fell onto the soft bed. "That was my mom. Your mother-in-law." "What?" So it was all a big misunderstanding. His voice rang in my ear, hoarse and deep, captivating. "Sarah has no appetite for food. How about trying something else?" "What?" His hand slowly moved up. My heart started pounding, and I couldn't help but swallow nervously. Johnson is really a seductive man. That I dragged my sore and hungry body and searched for something to eat in the kitchen. It was almost dark outside. Looking at the pile of ingredients in front of me, I wondered how I could turn them into a delicious meal. Just then, Johnson wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, resting his chin in the crook of my neck. His breath was like the scent of orchids, making me feel a tingling sensation. "Sarah, are you still hungry?" When I heard his bewitching voice in my ear, I suddenly felt weak in the knees and dizzy. I quickly leaned against the wall to steady myself, looking as delicate as a willow swaying in the wind. "You go and sit on the sofa. What would you like to eat? I'll make it for you." I nodded and excitedly named several dishes. Johnson frowned. Obviously, he thought there were better things to eat than those. So I sensibly only chose 2 dishes and then turned around obediently and went to the living room to wait to be fed. Before leaving, I even stood on tiptoe and planted a kiss on his face. The next day, I went to the company. Those gossipy colleagues from last time grabbed me all of a sudden and asked me anxiously, "We thought you were fired by the boss." I frowned, completely puzzled. "I heard that you picked up the boss on your moped after his business dinner at that high-end private restaurant, and it made him lose a lot of face. Since you didn't come to the company these past few days, we thought you were fired." "Yeah, with Mr. Johnson's temper. How did you manage to appease him? It must have cost you a lot, right?" My eyes swept over everyone, and I couldn't help but swallow nervously. The cost. It seemed to be quite high. Anyway, my legs were still sore. "I don't know. Mr. Johnson gave me 2 days off. He didn't say anything else." Everyone looked at me suspiciously, but since it was working time and they didn't dare to gather for too long, they said they would talk more during lunch. That I nodded and slowly walked into the office. A man who works seriously is really handsome. I held my face in my hands and stared intently at Johnson, who was working with his head down. Suddenly, I felt a little guilty about receiving my salary. So I got up, made a cup of coffee for him, and brought it over. Johnson raised his hand, took off his glasses, rubbed his temples, and then pulled me, who was standing beside him, into his arms. That I covered my mouth, almost letting out a cry of surprise. I stared at Johnson with wide eyes. He had a look of triumph on his face, and then he leaned in and kissed my face. "This is the office, and people are coming and going. Let me go first." I looked warily towards the door, afraid that we would be discovered the next second. That would be so embarrassing. You're my wife. What are you afraid of? Johnson didn't let go and held me even tighter with his arms around me. But they don't know that I'm your wife. I'm still counting on them to gossip with me. So those stories about little models and other women were all what they talked to you about privately. Johnson looked at me with a sudden realization. I realized I had said too much and quickly shook my head, struggling to get out of his arms when it was time for lunch. Johnson was still buried in his work. Those colleagues outside the door gave me meaningful looks. But I didn't dare to speak up for a long time. Aren't you going to listen to the gossip? Bring me a portion when you're done eating. He looked up at me. My little thought was exposed on the spot, but I didn't feel the slightest bit of embarrassment. I nodded excitedly, grabbed my phone, and rushed out the door. Just before getting off work, Johnson suddenly appeared. Let's go, Sarah. Let's go home. Dozens of pairs of eyes turned towards me all at once. I felt as if there were thorns on my back. I stiffly turned around and looked at Johnson. I felt that he did it on purpose. Mr. Johnson means that he will give me a ride home on the way. I seemed to hear everyone heaving a sigh of relief. I smiled and walked into the office. When I passed by Johnson, I gave him a fierce glare that I really don't want to be the subject of gossip during my lifetime. Not long after, there was a company dinner party. Normally, the boss doesn't need to attend such occasions, but this time, Johnson spent a large sum of money and reserved a private room in a high-end private restaurant. Everyone was shocked. You know, it's not easy to get a meal there even if you have money. You need to be a VIP customer and make a reservation in advance. Mr. Johnson was very generous. But in the company chat group, he said, this was specially arranged by Mrs. Johnson. Everyone has been working hard recently. The chat group exploded. Everyone was guessing who this Mrs. Johnson was. Who could make the usually cold, stingy Mr. Johnson change his ways? That I hid aside. Trembling, Johnson's eyes lingered on me. I held the glass of wine in my hand, not knowing what to do. Come on. Let's all have a toast. I'll drink Sarah's wine for her. After all, she'll have to ride the moped to take me home later. Everyone burst into laughter, leaving me alone in an embarrassing situation. That I channeled my embarrassment into the joy of eating and kept gobbling up those delicious and rare dishes. Don't eat too much. You'll have a stomachache again at night. I had just stuffed 2 meatballs into my mouth. I turned to look at Johnson. It was all his fault. Ha ha ha. Sarah, why are you so cute? You look like a little hamster. A male colleague in the company poked my chubby face and then burst out laughing. That I didn't even need to turn around to feel that the atmosphere around us had obviously turned cold. I could imagine how dark Johnson's face must be. Our Sarah is a great beauty, and she's still single. If you agree, type 1 and hope God forgives you. Everyone chattered on, and the situation was developing in an uncontrollable direction. For safety's sake, I quickly lied that Mr. Johnson was drunk and quickly pulled him to pay the bill and leave. In public. If Johnson, who was so jealous, got angry, I wouldn't be able to control the situation. As soon as we got to the villa, Johnson bent down and carried me on his shoulder towards the bedroom. I struggled on his back, hitting his solid back. Put me down first. What are you doing? What am I doing? Let's have a baby soon so that others will stay away from you. In the dimly lit room, Johnson leaned over me. His kisses landed one by one, starting from my forehead, nose, eyes, and then to my lips, as if he wanted to devour me bit by bit. Early the next morning, the doorbell rang. That I shuffled downstairs in my slippers, with my hair all messy, to open the door, looking at the elegantly dressed lady outside the door, who was Johnson's mother. I pretended to be confused and laughed awkwardly. I came to borrow some soy sauce. After saying that, I tried to squeeze past her to go outside, but Johnson called me from behind. Sarah, what are you doing? I turned around and gave him a fierce look. When he saw the person behind me, he immediately came downstairs, put his coat on me first, and then smiled and led his mother inside. You're Sarah. We've met before. Johnson's mother had an elegant temperament and spoke gently. It made me think of the embarrassing scene outside the restaurant. I felt so impolite. There's a photo of you in Johnson's bedroom. You're still as beautiful as ever. Young lady. My smile froze on my face. Wasn't our first encounter outside the restaurant last time? Why was there a photo of me in Johnson's bedroom? We had just gotten together not long ago. Could it be an old photo? Mom. Johnson's face turned red. He handed a glass of water to his mother and looked at me nervously. His mother looked puzzled, not quite understanding the situation. Auntie, I'm really sorry. I haven't been able to visit you and Uncle in person for such a long time. Please forgive me. His mother smiled and shook her head. She took out a very exquisitely wrapped box from her bag and slowly opened it. Inside was a delicately carved, hollow bracelet with an antique feel, inlaid with several natural and precious gemstones. This bracelet was passed down to me by Johnson's grandmother when I married into the Johnson family. It's meant for the Johnson family's daughter-in-law, Johnson. Come here and put it on Sarah. I stood there, stunned, my heart pounding that I quickly stood up. Johnson took the bracelet, knelt down on one knee, gently put the bracelet on my wrist, and then bowed his head and kissed the back of my hand. It looks so beautiful. Sarah really suits it. Why are you still calling me auntie? Now you're already a daughter-in-law of the Johnson family. My face turned red, and I softly called out, Mom. His mother smiled and nodded, looking very satisfied. Now I've finally fulfilled one of my wishes. When Johnson said he wanted to marry you, I wanted to give this to you, but this boy wouldn't let me, saying that the time wasn't right. Now I can finally rest assured. I'll go back and tell your father that we should start preparing for the wedding banquet at home. After saying that, she got up and left in a car. After my mother-in-law left, I turned around and grabbed Johnson, who was trying to run away, with a fierce expression on my face. Mr. Johnson, care to explain? Johnson's eyes darted around, and he just wouldn't look at me. I held his face in my hands, forcing him to look me in the eyes. His cheeks were burning hot, and his heart was pounding wildly in his chest, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Sarah, we did know each other in high school, but you don't remember me. I frowned. I really couldn't recall having such a handsome person in my youthful days. At that time, because I had been taking medicine for a long time, my body got fatter and fatter. My schoolmates all stayed away from me and mocked me for being a chubby kid. I couldn't do well in the long jump, and I would gasp for breath after just running a few steps, but only you. You pushed through the crowd and protected me behind you. You were such a small person, yet you gave me so much courage. Later, when my parents came back from abroad, they took me to another city to seek medical treatment, and since then, I never saw you again. I never imagined that we had such a connection. What about the blind date? Johnson turned his face away. It seemed that he really went to great lengths to pursue me. He not only bribed the ladies around my mom but also had a clear understanding of my situation. So this was all premeditated. Johnson leaned into my arms, looking gentle and affectionate, as if only at this moment was everything real. I've been weaving this big net since I was a teenager, planning to catch you, this little fox, all at once. Sarah, you can't escape. There seemed to be a sky full of stars in his eyes, shining brightly, and my heart felt as sweet as if it was smeared with honey. I held his face and gently kissed him. It turned out that our fate was already sealed long ago. Johnson announced his good news at the company and invited everyone to the wedding. On the wedding day, when everyone saw the bride, they were all shocked and covered their mouths. Oh no, the enemy has infiltrated our ranks, and we didn't even know it. You fool. What enemy? This is the boss's wife. Everyone burst into laughter, and the atmosphere was full of joy. The center of the stage, I was wearing an exquisitely beautiful wedding dress. Johnson took my hand from my father and led me along a path paved with rose petals towards the wedding hall. My parents were in tears. My mom was very sociable and quickly became good friends with Johnson's mother. She even taught the always gentle and quiet Mrs. Johnson how to play poker and would occasionally say some casual swear words. Mr. Johnson, do you take this beautiful bride beside you to be your wife? I've been dreaming of this day for 10 years. Finally, I can marry the girl I've loved for 10 years. I'm more than willing. There were screams of excitement all around. Johnson put a ring on my finger and kissed his beautiful bride. The sea breeze blew, carrying a romantic atmosphere. On the most important day of my life, with my relatives and friends gathered around and the person I loved the most by my side, I felt that my life was complete. 10 months later, at the Johnson family villa. Sarah, you need to take care of yourself recently. You're about to give birth. 8. In the context of poker game. Don't worry, Mom. Johnson made all the arrangements months ago. With Johnson around. Of course I'm not worried. 8 of clubs. I'll take it. I frowned. She was playing poker again. I rolled my eyes and hung up the phone helplessly. Johnson was organizing all the baby's things. The villa was already filled with them. But he still seemed to think it wasn't enough that I looked at the bright sunshine outside. The usually cold Mr. Johnson had now become a nagging househusband, but he made all kinds of delicious food for me every day. And I had gained so much weight that I had grown 2 sizes fatter. Not long after I gave birth to a baby boy safely, Johnson held his lovely son and fell into deep thought. I clearly dreamed of a baby girl. Mrs. Johnson took the baby from his arms and couldn't resist teasing him. I also wanted a daughter back then, but ended up with you. Why didn't I just abandon you? Johnson looked at the baby and then came over to me, asking if I was in pain. I smiled and shook my head. It was all worth it. Johnson kissed me on the forehead. When he looked up, I caught a glimpse of the tears in the corner of his eyes. Even though he turned away, I understood his worry, fear, and the joy in his heart. That I reached out and held his hand. He turned back to look at me and finally smiled through his tears. Thank you, Sarah. I love you. I love you too.